Just want to walk through the the Open Assessments fork of the Canvas starter app and show off a little bit about how we're using React. This is the application we're building. It used to be written in Ember and we're moving it over to React. So just wanted to walk through, I guess, a few of the things that we're doing as we convert from one to the other. So here's the application. Uses the Flux architecture. And it starts, I think we walked through some of this before, but we have this app.jsx. And one of the things that I ran into as I began to convert this application over is that we used to really have a lot of objects. And a lot of those objects were derived from different kinds of Ember objects, whether they were Ember models from the Ember data layer or if they were just plain objects that were from Ember objects. We did that in Ember because we needed to be able to observe data changes. But as we transition to React, there's no need to do that anymore because the data flows one direction. So right here you can see an example of this with this settings. We've got the app.jsx file. This is kind of the point where the application kicks off. It's kind of your main. This imports the router and tells the router to run. Before we would have done this, well, I can show you really quickly how we used to do this inside of the Ember application. So we had this settings.js initializer, and you can see that it was doing this inject the settings model into everything, basically, into all the controllers and all the routes. So we were kind of making this global object out of this settings from model settings. So let's go pull it up. You can see that it extends the Ember object, and it has all these as properties, and that those properties depended upon this params property, which was this guy up here, which is something we parsed out of the URL. And then we also had a situation where sometimes we need to be able to get global values from this object called OEA settings that the Rails application writes into the page. With with React, we've moved away from the need to use objects that are derived from Ember objects. Now we can just use plain old JavaScript objects. So we've got this settings.load right here. And if I go look at the settings, it's no longer a model. It's just a method, really. And you can see this is much less code. So we were able to reduce the amount of code, mainly because we don't need to observe these values. They're not going to change. We load this thing once when the application kicks off, and then we have these available to us throughout the application. Now, I've also kind of wanted to avoid having a global object that just kind of sits around in the background. So what I've done is, in the app.jsx, when the router runs, it's going to call react.render, and then you give it this handler object. And you can give the handler any properties that you'd like. So two of the properties that I pass in are the params and the settings. And really, we could probably just delete the parameters because pretty much everything that we need is encapsulated in this object that's returned by this settings.load. So now, if I go to index.jsx, we have this route handler. So route handler is where the Ember router is going to render whatever component should be currently active based on the routes. So we've got routes over here. The default route is assessment. So when we hit the default route, we're going to render the assessment component. If we hit one of these other ones like login or register, it would render those components. And those components are going to need to get rendered into this spot. So that's what that is for. This syntax right here means take anything that was passed to me as a property and just pass it to my children, so that you don't have to specify every single thing and do something like settings equals this dot props.settings, and then to pass params and so on and so forth. It's just a shortcut so that we don't have to do that, because really we want to be able to pass everything down to the children and not have to worry about all the details and typing it out every single time. So now what that's going to do is it's going to render this assessment.jsx component right here. And this is where I started running into some issues of, well, started to question how the application loads, because if I call assessment.current, where this assessment is the assessment store, it's going to be empty because nothing has triggered the AJAX call back to the server to load the assessment. So to me, it really feels like the React router should be able to trigger actions as well. That way it could help to initialize a store. But since it doesn't, in the getInitialState, when we look for an assessment, we check to see if it's null. If it is, then we're going to call an action, and we're going to say, hey, go out and load the assessment. Go out and figure this out for us. And then after the component mounts, meaning it's been rendered into the page, we'll check to see if we do have an assessment. In other words, it's not null. And if we do, then we're going to send another action. And this actually does make sense, I think, because it's sort of a user-triggered action, which is this user viewed this assessment. And that's just for our stats recording. That was in the Ember application as well. And I think it was in here that we did all that stuff. So we used to have this route, the application route, the main route, that kind of kicked things off. You can see here's where we were getting settings, and that settings object was injected in as a global settings object. Down here we have the model that is part of every Ember route. And you can see that we are using a promise that we're going to resolve by the assessment being loaded. So here we created an assessment, and then that triggers the assessment actually getting loaded, and then that would trigger the assessment result, that little bit of stats that I showed you in the React code. This is where that happens. And then once that's done, then we can resolve and move on down the chain and actually load the assessment and show it to the user, and so on and so forth. In the React case, I think we've been able to simplify that. So instead of having a whole bunch of extra routing code, we just trigger an action and we say, hey, go record that the assessment was viewed, and then go on your merry way. We don't need to wait for that to return. So are there any questions about the view part of this so far? Because I'm going to move into the actions. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no, that everybody understands how the view gets rendered. Because down in this code, we're actually going to render some of the values from the assessment. We're triggering these actions, so it's worth looking at some of these actions. So here's the load assessment action. Here's the assessment viewed action. And load assessment is first going to trigger another action that says, hey, we're in the process of loading the assessment. That way, if there are any components that want to listen and maybe display a message to the user that says, hey, the assessment is currently loading, they could do that based on an event coming, or based on the data in the store changing and then updating to say, I'm currently in the pending or loading state. If the settings that are passed in indicate that the assessment is an offline assessment, it means that the entire assessment data is actually embedded in the page. We don't need to make an AJAX call to go out and get the assessment, in which case it's going to trigger an action, or it's going to send out an action through the dispatcher to say, hey, we already have the data, here it is, and then the store can respond to that. And we'll show you the store code here in just a second. Otherwise, we need to go out and get it. And then once the API is done with this GET request, it will trigger the dispatcher, I guess is probably the better way to say it. We'll tell the dispatcher to dispatch a given action or given constant. Same thing with the assessment viewed. We've got the body here that we're building up that contains all of the data that we need to record for the statistics, and then that's going to do a post back to the server. So instead of having a data layer filled with models, this is kind of where the interactions with the server happen. Okay, so just real quick then, take a look at the assessment store. You can see right here that we've registered with the dispatcher. When we get a new action, we're going to look at those actions, and the only one that we're going to care about is that the assessment has been loaded. I might also come in and say, let's add another one that says we'll respond to this other action, which was the load pending. And when we do that, we might just add some kind of a flag or something that would be loading is true, something like that. Oops. And that way we can say, we could add a method in here, is loading. And that could be returned to one of the components that would want to display a message to indicate that the assessment is currently loading. All right. So then the other thing that you can do right here, or that we do, is that as the assessment is loaded, we call this load assessment, which allows us to actually parse the data. And load assessment I've not currently implemented yet because that actually is a fairly sophisticated piece of code. We're going to pull out of the Ember code. Right now that lives in the Ember model. And you can see there's a whole bunch of parsing of XML and whatnot that happens inside of here. So when we did this with Ember, all of this parsing is going to return objects that are wrapped in an Ember array proxy that you can then observe. But when we do that in the React code, it's just going to return a JavaScript array that contains plain old JavaScript objects. Again, because there's no need to watch for changes in the data. If the data changes, it's going to trigger this reload of the data and a complete re-render through the React layer. So that's just a little piece of how we're transitioning this over from Ember into React. It's not a direct translation because there's no models necessarily in React. There's stores, but stores aren't models, but they kind of are. They deal with your data. There's no real actions in Ember. So basically you have to take the logic of the one application and then think through what's actually going on and then translate that logic into the Flux architecture. Okay, any questions? Have I thoroughly confused everybody?
It's a lot simpler without the object proxies.
I feel like it is.
I feel like it.
For sure.
Sure.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll let everybody go. At some point in time, maybe we'll do like a hack afternoon and start and maybe work on converting all these components, these Ember components, over, and then everybody could take one and go work on it. And that, I think, would help give everybody a feel for kind of this experience of both writing a React component and what it's like to move from one framework to the other.